All right, let's jump right into this explainer, because today we are going to completely dismantle the intuitive illusion we all have about the physical space we actually live in. We usually think of space as a given, right? Just this vast, pre-existing emptiness where stars, planets, and, well, us just happen to exist. It's like the stage where the play of the universe takes place. But what if space isn't the room where the universe happens? What if, instead, space is actually the exhaust created by the universe running its fundamental code? I know, it sounds wild, almost like science fiction, but the math behind this is breathtakingly elegant, and it fundamentally rewrites what it means for anything to exist.
Listen to this radical shift in perspective from our source material. You do not actually live inside space. Rather, space is an accumulated residue. Think of it like a historical ledger of changes that have already occurred. To really wrap our heads around what a non-commuting change is and why it physically leaves a residue behind, we need to take a hard look at how we traditionally view reality and compare that to what the strict mathematics of continuous change actually demands of our universe. So, we naturally picture space as this giant empty bucket holding reality. A bucket defines a rigid boundary, right? It can be full of water or it can be completely empty, but the volume of that bucket exists either way, completely independent of whatever is inside it. But the physics of change tells a completely different story. Space is actually the exhaust left behind by the universe's internal operations. There is no bucket. There is no pre-existing arena. There is literally only the mathematical residue generated strictly because things are forced to change. And that absolute, unyielding necessity of change, well, that all stems from one single inescapable rule.
That single rule, which we'll call Constraint 1, or just C1, cascades mathematically to create the entirety of the physical world we experience. C1 is the absolute foundational axiom of the universe. It states unequivocally that nothing can fail to change, period. No state, no mathematical coordinate, no physical law can hold absolutely still forever. Because if it did hold still, it would be a fixed point, a moment of pure absolute stasis, and C1 mathematically outlaws fixed points. The universe is literally a system that violently prevents itself from ever stopping. But here's the catch. This single rule creates a fascinating problem when we start talking about things moving, shifting, and changing within that system. Right away, C1 throws us into this really profound paradox. If you change, and then you change back flawlessly, you've created a perfectly closed loop that leaves absolutely zero record behind. Think about it. Imagine taking a step forward, a step right, a step backward, and a step left. If you end up in the exact perfectly identical state you started in, with absolutely zero trace of the journey, then according to the strict logic of C1, that change didn't actually happen. It was a false change. It was just stasis in disguise. And since C1 totally outlaws stasis, it must also outlaw any changes that leave no trace.
And that is exactly why perfectly commuting loops, what mathematicians and physicists call Abelian changes, are just straight up illegal under C1. In an Abelian system, things perfectly commute. That means doing action A, then action B, is exactly the same as doing action B, then action A. The mathematical loops close flawlessly, leaving a net displacement of zero. But because leaving zero trace means no change actually occurred, C1 absolutely forbids Abelian change groups. It just says no. Therefore, the universe's operational rules absolutely have to be non-Abelian. Transformations simply cannot perfectly commute. When you do A, then B, and then try to undo them by reversing A, then B, you do not end up exactly where you started. The universe literally forces the loop to fail to close perfectly, leaving a mandatory permanent trace.
So because reality literally has to pay a tax for changing in order to avoid that illegal stasis, it leaves behind a sort of writer's residue. Mathematically, this is known as the lie bracket, written out as A, B inside brackets. The lie bracket is the literal measurement of the failure of two changes to commute. It's the exact mathematical trace of the loop that refused to close. The universe cannot change for free, you guys. It has to leave a permanent record that the change happened so it doesn't violate C1. This lie bracket is that record. It's the unclosable gap. And here is where the pure abstract mathematics suddenly violently crashes into physical reality in a truly spectacular way.
Okay, so here is the bridge between the math and our actual lives. That mathematical error of a loop failing to close, the lie bracket, manifests physically to us as curvature. And curvature is exactly what we call physical force. Force isn't some extra magical ingredient sprinkled into the universe after the fact. Force is simply the necessary price of a recorded change.
Because C1 demands that a trace must be left, curvature has to exist. And because curvature exists, force exists. Force is just the physical shadow of the mathematical rule that says, hey, change must leave a trace.
So think about it. Force isn't just an invisible string pulling objects together. It is the inescapable, mandatory price the universe pays to legally record that a change took place. When you feel the pull of gravity, or witness the interactions of subatomic particles, you are actively watching the universe settle its accounting book. It is the thermodynamic and geometric cost of making a permanent commit in the ledger of reality. So, if these non-commuting loops mandate curvature, and curvature dictates physical force, what else do they generate?
Let's actually walk through how this math physically builds our world step by step. Step 1. A change occurs in an independent direction. Let's just call it direction A. Step 2. A change occurs in a second independent direction, B. Now, step 3 is where the absolute magic happens. Because we've established that C1 forbids A and B from commuting perfectly, they generate a residue. But that mathematical residue can't exist in direction A, and it can't exist in direction B. It needs somewhere to go. The Lie bracket actually forces the creation of a mathematically independent third direction. The exhaust itself becomes a brand new axis of reality.
The Lie bracket of those first two changes actually forces a third direction to exist, which perfectly completes the mathematical structure. In physics, this specific structure is known as closing the algebra at rank 3, forming what's called the rotation group SO3. But what does that actually mean for us in plain English? Well, it's literally the mathematical blueprint of our three-dimensional physical space. You don't have to artificially plug a 3D arena into this theory for it to work. The non-commuting changes inherently make it. The birth of our three-dimensional physical world is simply the algebra closing. Space isn't a container that was built for us to sit in. Space is literally what the bracket generates before it closes.
This means every single time you move your arm, you aren't sliding through an empty, pre-existing room. You are traversing the historical ledger of the universe's prior, irreversible decisions. The residue of these cosmic writer commits accumulates around us, and that accumulated exhaust is exactly what we perceive as distance, volume, and dimension. The writer's cost, that force trace necessary to avoid stasis, closes into the reader's new dimension. It's a completely self-generating system, driven purely from the bottom up by the absolute impossibility of standing still.
All right, let's bring it all together. The big takeaway from this explainer is a total inversion of how we see reality. C1 dictates that change is universally mandatory, which completely outlaws perfect Abelian stasis. Because perfectly commuting loops are forbidden, transformations are forced to be non-Abelian, leaving behind that mathematical residue known as the Lie bracket. We physically feel that unclosable gap as curvature and force. And ultimately, that very exhaust weaves together to generate the third direction, closing the algebra at rank 3 and giving us the physical space we inhabit. 3D space and gravity aren't the setting of the universe. They are the mathematical exhaust required to keep the universe running.
I want to leave you with one final thought to really chew on. The universe isn't a place you exist inside of. It's a machine violently preventing itself from stopping, and the physical reality we walk through is simply the ledger of its unclosed loops. If space is just accumulated exhaust and you are made of these exact same changing, non-commuting physical systems, are you really a passenger in space, or is your consciousness just another complex knot of the universe's unclosed loops? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.